Hey everyone, on this week's Jolly Lark, we're painting a new army, a Night's Watch army for a Song of Ice and Fire miniatures game. Like any project I'm trying to get done quickly, I'll start with a black undercoat, and here I'm hitting it with a quick medium gray dry brush to get started. If you don't have an airbrush, you can absolutely do that with any big fat dry brush of your choice. Just make sure, like you would with an airbrush, that you're dry brushing down from above. You'll get a similar sort of from above natural highlight scheme. These miniatures are super easy to work with since they come pre-assembled. So we're going to see how long it takes to paint a 40-point army for the Song of Ice and Fire miniatures game. Got about an hour probably of assembling, basing, and priming all these, scraping off the most obvious mold line, and gluing some sand to the bases. But we're able to jump into this project pretty quickly. It took about 15 minutes to give all of these a quick airbrush overcoat. On top of the airbrushing, because I'm not good enough with an airbrush to have this level of control, we're hitting it with a quick, big fat dry brush. You can see just a couple of seconds on each figure, a big fat dry brush of a light gray. In this case, I'm using the Monument Hobbies Pro-Acryl bright warm gray. And like you're used to with dry brushing, I'm just trying to hit the edges, the corners, tips of their knees that are sticking out. And I'm paying a little bit more attention to the fur cloaks that all of these Night's Watch brothers have. You can see adding just a little bit of brightness to the fur. Those are going to get a layer of wash later. So we want to make sure that there's enough brightness now to be ready for a wash later. If you put a wash, a contrast wash or a traditional wash over too dark of an undercoat, you won't have the contrast you need. So as we go through this project, I'm not going to show you painting every single miniature. That would be a little tedious. Occasionally you'll notice the 3X symbol up in the upper right. It means we've sped up the pace. So next step, we're going into a white gold layer. White gold is my go-to starting point for most metals, using a little bit thinner brush mixed with a tiny bit of water. And we're preparing the miniatures for a wash step at this point. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in and with all the miniatures hit all of the metal parts with a thin coat of the Pro-Acryl white gold. This is a really versatile color with a flesh wash, like a Gilman flesh or something like that. You can get it to look kind of coppery or gold. With a Nuln oil wash, you can get it to look more like a steely silver, just a really versatile metallic. It covers nicely. One of the challenges with doing a Night's Watch army, if you're familiar with the Game of Thrones Song of Ice and Fire universe, is that they all wear black, every single one of them. Taking the black means joining the Night's Watch. When painting an army where everybody is wearing all black, it's a real challenge to introduce a little bit of color and contrast. With this project, I'm going to try to add a little more visual interest by making sure that their fur cloaks, the fur that you see there on top of their cloaks, is not going to be all whites and grays. We're going to add some russety reds, some oranges, some other kind of natural colors. We'll obviously have the faces to stand out. And also with the black itself, they're not wearing black velvet. They're not going to be a deep dark black. They're going to be a very light, sun-faded, well-worn black cloaks and black clothes. If you read the books, you know that the Night's Watch as an organization, they are underfunded, undermanned. They are not wearing nice, new, fresh out of the dyeing vats clothing. Their blacks are going to be very, very faded. If you've ever seen a pair of sun-washed or acid-washed black jeans, you'll know that black can fade to a pretty bright color. So for the next step, we're grabbing a pot of Pro-Acryl copper. I'm going to hit some of the miniatures, some of the hilts of some of the swords with the copper. And this is a trick for speed painting. If you go in and do the metals first, with a silver on the blades, and I like the copper for some details and belt buckles and sword hilts and decorations and stuff like that, you'll find that you can wash them both at the same time, and they're both a strong enough metallic color to stand up to that. And to make sure that the army's not too samey, I'm just trying to introduce a little bit of variation into what's what. I'm not painting every single hilt copper. Some of them you'll see later are brown, some of them are silver, some of them are copper. kind of as I pick up each miniature, I'm trying to just add a little bit of variety and variation. When speed painting an army, the most important thing is to not have to redo steps. When you're putting the black wash on the miniature, you want to be black washing everything that needs a black wash all at the same time. As much as possible, you want to go in and do all your base coats, and dry brushing is my general first step, and preparing it for washes. So at this point, this unit has got black, medium gray, light gray, silver, and copper on it. We're going to quickly pop in some of the metallic details on the rest of the army. And you notice at the beginning of the video, what this army is, it's 3 units of infantry. And in the Song of Ice and Fire game, each infantry unit has 12 models. So we've got 36 infantry models. We've also got 2 single mounted units. There's Ghost, the wolf, and a single mounted ranger who works on his own in the game. We've also got 4 characters. So all told, this army is a 40-point army, which is kind of the standard game these days for A Song of Ice and Fire, and includes 42 miniatures. So here we've got the unit of Sworn Brothers, ready to go. Moving on and popping a little bit of metals onto the cutthroats. And this painting was done over the course of a couple of days. But as you can see, it's really not going to take that long to knock out the entire army. All told, start to finish, including the time to glue the gravel on the bases, to do all the airbrushing, and to give it a matte sealant, all told, took in between about 6 and 7 hours of work. Now, that's a little bit more than you might do on any given one evening, and it's sometimes nice to space it out so that you can have time for washes to dry and for glue to dry on the bases and stuff like that. But that's a pretty quick get an army playable and ready project. It wouldn't be that hard, which is exactly what I did, to get this army go from out of the box to onto the table in just a few evenings of work. So one thing you'll notice here is that the gravel on the bases, which is a mix of some old railroad ballast that I had kicking around, is not primed. And this is actually a mistake I would do differently next time. I generally like to put the basing texture when I'm using textured paints like a Grell and Earth or something. I generally like to put the textured paint over primer because I feel like it sticks better. But when using glue and unpainted gravel, I think I'd rather do that before priming next time. There's a step here where I need to paint all that gravel. I need to wash all that gravel with a dark brown or a black. And that's a step I could have saved myself. So that's probably 20 minutes of work that I could have saved myself next time. But live and learn. I'm used to putting the texture on after priming, and that's what I did here, but that's not something I would do again. That would save, and it's a messy step to wash all that gravel with a black wash. So now I've moved on here and I've got a couple shades of brown. I'm using a couple shades of Pro-Acryl brown, which are my go-to paints these days. And I'm coming in on all the miniatures. And this is, again, another way to add a little bit more color to break up some of the monotony of the black on black on black on black. And I'm painting all of the leather straps with either the Pro-Acryl dark or light umber. I've also got a spot of the Pro-Acryl Ivory on my palette that you can see in the lower left there. And I'm kind of trying to go in and add a little bit of highlighting as I go, but most of the highlighting is going to come at the very last step, as you'll see later on. I'm a big fan of adding a final universal highlight to everything to make it pop. The other reason I've got the Ivory on my palette is for painting faces. Those are going to get a flesh wash later. But you can put the faces on now and paint some other parts that might be brighter later on in Ivory. There's no right or wrong way to do this. I'm just kind of trying to decide as I pick up each miniature, is this person going to have light hair or dark hair? Is this person going to have light skin or dark skin? And I like having a couple of shades of brown on my palette as I'm doing this so that I can be handling the miniatures as little as possible. Again, trying to save a little bit of time. So The same medium brown that you use for somebody's gloves, you can also use that for their skin. If you put on a medium brown on their face, that means they're going to have that much darker skin when you wash it later. Oh, that one slipped out. These are slippery little buggers sometimes. You can see on this miniature, I've also painted the wrappings on the sword hilt a lighter brown. Again, just another attempt to add a little bit more variety into the unit. Just those little touches of different colored sword wrappings, different colored belts, so even subtly different, really helps. So this is the unit of Sworn Brothers. They're all armed with 2 weapons, and they're getting there. You know, at that point, they've got 3 colors. You could probably put that on the table and call it a go if you, painted the bases and called that 3-color table ready. But we can take it a little bit further and make it look that much better. Picking up and starting on the crossbowmen here, you'll obviously they've got crossbows. I want to make sure I get the wood on the crossbows an all over even brown. There's some little bands that look like metal bands around the crossbows, and I'm just leaving those the gray of the primer layer. I don't think anybody's going to notice that those aren't painted metallics. They'll just kind of look like dull iron bands once they've gotten a black wash. And you'll notice I sometimes see my thumb come in there and give the miniature a swipe. Don't be afraid to use your fingers. The paint, when it's first on, you can often fix a lot of mistakes just by giving it a little swipe with the tip of your finger. Now, you also notice these crossbowmen look a little bit lighter. I was a little heavier handed with the airbrush when I went over these. Had my PSI turned up a little high on the airbrush. Right now, these cloaks don't really look black per se. They look more like a stark light gray. That's okay, we'll darken it up in the wash step. You can fix a lot of mistakes there. So another reason I wanted to have that ivory on my palette is I knew I would want to have a lighter color for some of the arrow fletchings. So I'm just giving those a quick little pop, pop, pop of light color. And even little details like that will help draw the eye once the miniature is all done. One thing that can sometimes be challenging when doing army projects like this, if you're not as experienced with batch speed painting, is that the miniatures go from looking not that great up to pretty polished and game ready, just really in the last 2 steps, like the last 2 or 3 steps. Up at this point, the miniatures are intentionally looking a little drab. We're going to count on the washes and the highlight step later to give them the sort of contrast and pop that's going to make them look good on the table. The bases also do a lot of work with that. Getting some nice contrast on the bases, getting some snow and some grass tufts on the bases will go a long way towards making what are a little bit drab on drab miniatures pop a little bit more on the tabletop. And with speed painting, it's sometimes, we call it speed painting, but ultimately you can end up saving yourself some time by being careful using a pointy enough brush that you can get in the details and not have to fix mistakes. A lot of that's just practice, but getting in and painting the details confidently, don't rush and start making mistakes, because fixing mistakes takes longer than doing it right the first time. We're just coming in, painting all the little pouches, straps. If you're used to painting Games Workshop figures, something you'll notice if you give some other game a try is the level of detail is not as high on these figures as you might expect from a Citadel miniature. It's a good and a bad thing. If you're trying to get a force done quickly, it can be a good thing. There's just not as much detail there to paint. As a result, you can paint the miniatures fairly fast and still have them be fully painted. Sometimes with some of my Age of Sigmar forces, like the Kharadron army I finished recently, there's just so many details on there, and you really don't want to leave any of them unpainted, because then the miniature looks unfinished. So here we've got the unit of crossbowmen done. We're going to fade to black there and skip showing you every single model, since they're all pretty similar. But we've got the browns on the woods, some ivory on the faces, and some of the crossbows are going to stay gray, and they'll still look good with a brown wash on them later. So here, this unit is the Veterans. These are my favorite unit in the army. They really, with a 3+ armor save in the game, they stick around for a while. I'm usually running these with my commander in them. And these are armed with 2 weapons, so they've got relatively more attacks. In the Game of Thrones miniatures game, it sometimes can be a little bit challenging to tell the different units apart because they all are dressed in similar black cloaks with fur on the shoulders, but with a couple of games under your belt, often their weapon choices are enough to tell them apart, at least for the Night's Watch army. The Veterans have the 2 weapons, the Swarm Brothers have the 2-handed weapons, crossbows have crossbows, as is obvious. Something I didn't notice on these as I was dry brushing them, but a lot of them have a black hood that separates their face from the fur on their shoulders, and that'll help to differentiate, kind of make the faces pop later on. Once we give that black hood a little swipe of a black wash, that'll act kind of as a dividing line in between the brightness of some of the faces and the hair and the cloaks. So you can see with this one, I'm painting the hair the same ivory. It's almost acting like a white base coat, as if you had sprayed the miniature's Wraithbone. Obviously, I wanted to start with a black layer on these, since these are largely black miniatures. But again, at this stage, what you're really doing is prepping the models for a wash later. So the ones with lighter hair, the ones with lighter skinned faces, these aren't done, but it's almost like a second base coat to prepare them for some contrast washes later. In here, I'm just picking up the entire unit tray. Don't be afraid. You don't have to paint miniatures one at a time necessarily, especially if you have something you want to do to multiple miniatures at the same time and it's practical. With these, it's not hard to just grab them and hit all the faces quickly with a little bit of ivory. And again, choosing a couple to have lighter colored hair, that just introduces a nice variety into the unit. It's rare to find 12 people that all have exactly the same shade of hair. These miniatures don't have any posability really, unless you were getting into conversions, because they come all pre-assembled. So as much as you can do to introduce a little variety into the mix in the painting step, so much the better. So moving on to some of the characters, I'm going to spend a teeny bit more time on these, but not much. The way characters work in the game of Ice and Fire, is some of the characters, like Master Aemon here, are actually played on a tactics board off the table, and the other characters are added to the units. So with a few exceptions, the character models don't stand out on the table quite as much as character models in other games. So I'm going to spend a little bit of extra time on the details, but not so much. One of the things I've really been enjoying about playing with the Song of Ice and Fire game is, there's no superheroes. When you add a character to a unit, it gives it a cool special ability. It often can increase, kind of pop up its power a little bit. But it's not, you don't have characters smashing their way through unit after unit. You don't have unkillable magic characters. Adding a character to a unit, it's the difference of adding a special rule. Sometimes a powerful special rule, but still it's giving special rules, giving boosts to the unit. They're not powerhouses in their own right. When working with a licensed game like Game of Thrones, I've been a big fan of the books for a long time. I enjoyed the TV show. There is some level of, I don't know, honesty is not quite the right word, but some level of faithfulness to the series that I want to try to do. I'm not going to give Jon Snow red hair. In the show, in the books, he's described as having black hair. I'd give him black hair. If I was just painting this as an Age of Sigmar model, I probably would not have the general of my army have black hair, given that they're wearing all black all the time. Honestly, if I was painting an Age of Sigmar army, I probably wouldn't usually choose an all black color scheme, or at least I wouldn't have. This one has really grown on me. I could actually imagine doing another faded black army at some point in the future. It was pretty quick and easy, and as you'll see in the final steps, ended up with a result that I'm pretty pleased with. I think it looks sharp on the table. It helps that the Night's Watch are stationed at the cold northern walls of the kingdom, and I think that the snow bases really help out a lot in having this army look sharp on the tabletop. In the game, there are both kind of named characters like Jon Snow, and then this is a recruiter character who's like a little attachment you can add to a unit. Despite being kind of a weedy, unnamed character, he has a powerful special ability that actually lets him grab enemy models that are killed and use those to heal, recruiting the enemies for the Night's Watch unit that he's attached to. So he's been a powerful addition to the games I've played. So like I said earlier, there is one single mounted model in the army. This is a solo ranger that acts on his own and kind of rides around the battlefield, giving support to some of the other units. I'm not sure he's going to stay in my final army list, but I really, in the first 3 games I played, I really liked Ghost, the wolf, as a fast solo unit. I wanted to play around with having 2 of those in the army to see if that was useful for capturing objectives and supporting units. 40 points is the standard size game for Song of Ice and Fire, and it's not that much to play with. So a single model like this, I think, is 3 or 4 points. The units tend to range from 4 to 8 or 9 points. The attachments you can add, it's a point or 2 each. So generally a game of Ice and Fire, you're having somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 7 units, depending on the army. So adding this guy to the table felt like a way to get an extra activation, get a little bit of extra speed in what's otherwise a foot slogging army. The Song of Ice and Fire miniatures are from Cool Mini or Not, CMON, and they're reasonably affordable. You're going to pay about $30 for a unit or $30 for a box full of heroes. So with 5 or 6 units on the table, there's some starter sets that are a little bit better deal. You can often find better deals online or at your local game store. This is a game where you can get up and running for about $150 to $200. So now we're moving into some washes. On the palette there, we've got the Guilliman flesh and Darkoath flesh, along with some Nuln oil poured into a bottle cap there. We're going to use the Nuln oil to deepen the shadows on all the black areas of the miniature. And that'll just help increase the contrast. This means that the Nuln oil wash will create the final darkest, deepest shadow, while that light gray that we've got there becomes the second brightest highlight. Now, I say second brightest highlight because we're going to add a final little twinkle highlight at the end with a light dry brush all over the figure. So what we've got here is essentially we've got the midtones. With the washes, we're adding some shadow and color. The Nuln oil is mostly adding shadow and helping tell the story that these are black. And then we'll also add some color with some of the brown washes, both to the skin of the characters and to some of the furs. Now, you could paint these up with some disco pink furs on their shoulders or something, but again, I'm going to try to stay somewhat relevant to the show and keep these in fairly realistic colors. When applying washes, you always want to be kind of careful that they're not puddling and pooling too much. You certainly don't want them to be dripping and running all over the place. Lots of fans of Nuln oil out there, and for good reason. It really does a good job of going on a smooth coat. You can see on this big flowy cloak here, you can put it on in a pretty fast layer with a big thick brush and get a pretty even layer. You just hit, if you can see a little bit of a pool, and wipe that up with your brush, or like I just did there, knock it off with your thumb. I actually really like the technique, if you can call it that, of wiping the paint off the top surface with your thumb. It actually will often give you a little bit cleaner transition and highlight than using it with a brush, because your thumb will naturally kind of softly wipe it off the topmost raised edge. So pro tip, finger painting. And now I'm coming in with a little bit of Vallejo black glaze, which is a thicker transparent paint, and just hitting that a little bit on the undersides real quick while the glaze is still wet. You can skip that if you want, but using that black glaze can allow you to deepen the shadows even a little bit further on the underside. So here's where I said earlier, and here's the mistake I made. This should have been primed black. This washing the gravel on the base is totally fine. I just grabbed a fatter brush to do it a little faster. It works fine. It's no big deal. but I don't think I gained much from doing the wash here. You get a little bit of natural shadow and highlighting with the lighter colored brown ballast with a black wash. But honestly, I think I would have been 95% as good looking by just priming this whole thing black and then hitting it with a brown dry brush later, which I'm going to do anyway. So any of the color variation I gained from that step, I lost later on with a dry brush. So yeah, primer gravel. So here I'm just going to go figure again. I'll speed past some of these, and I'm not going to necessarily show every figure on screen, but I'm simultaneously, I've got a couple pots of paint open here, and you can see that I'm simultaneously washing the black with Nuln Oil, washing the metal with Nuln Oil, and washing the faces with Darkoath Flesh. I said earlier that what we were doing was preparing a base coat, and so knew I wanted to have a variety of skin tones in the army, and the way I achieved that is not with different contrast paints, but with different base coats. So Darkoath Flesh is a nice, ruddy, kind of reddish brown color, and it looks good over medium browns, light ivories, it looks good over flesh colors. So if you give your characters a wide variety of base coats on their skin tones, you can hit all the skin tones with that Darkoath Flesh, and you get a pretty good result. If you're going for some of the darker skin tones, you may end up wanting to use like an Aggros Earthshade or a Wyldwood. But there's all the colors of brown I've got on my palette there. Mostly contrast, a couple army painters. I did put the army painters on my palette, but I ended up not using them very much. They ended up having a little bit weaker colors than I was looking for this project, and largely stuck with the Gore Grunta fur, the Darkoath Flesh, and some of the other brown contrast paints. I put a list of all the colors used in the video description. So got the whole army arrayed out in front of me at this point. I've got a variety of browns on my palette, and here's where I'm going in and adding all of the color I was talking about earlier. This is where we take the army from blacks and grays and the base coats and the metals. Here's where we go in and add all that color. So we've got some kind of rich reddish browns. This is a snakebite leather there. We'll also be using some Skeletal Horde, which is a more of a yellow brown. And you can kind of smush around some other colors to add some of the natural variation you might find in fur. Don't be afraid to mix contrast paints on the miniature, especially on heavily textured areas like the fur. It's easy to put on a base coat of a lighter contrast like Skeleton Horde or Snakebite Leather. And then you can blend in a darker brown like Wyldwood or any of the other browns you'd like. And even if you want to go for something more like a fox fur, you could pull in a little of the contrast orange or something like that. It's not a huge difference, but I do think it gives it a little bit more natural color variation than you end up with just a single color. Put a nice medium brown contrast coat over gray, and you get a darker brown hair. So with those neutral undercoats, we can create a wide variety of shades very quickly. And the natural variation you get in an overbrushed or an airbrushed zenithal highlighting also gives you some more variation as you start putting the washes on. And when your army project includes 40-something figures, it's a very different style of project than painting one figure at a time. The goal here is for the army to look good as an army, not for this miniature to look amazing as a single miniature. The techniques for painting an army are obviously a lot of overlap, but I think fundamentally when the object you're painting is an army, you're going to take a little bit of a different attitude than when what you're painting is a single miniature. So you can create variation in hair colors by how much dry brushing you did earlier. You can create variation by how much contrast medium you add. A 50-50 mix of Gore Grunta fur and contrast medium is going to give a very different color brown than pure Gore Grunta fur, for example. So just going miniature by miniature, this is the longest single step in the army painting, but it's also a fun one because here's where the miniatures are really coming into their own. And you can see as I'm working on my palette there, I'm being really messy with my brush. What I want is a bunch of different colors. I'm not painting matching ultramarines or guardsmen or something here. These are natural materials, hand-dyed fabrics. I want variety. I just grabbed some contrast black Templar there. I want to have some black in the mix that I can use to add variety, add a little extra shading, and add a thinned down black Templar wash for anybody who I want to have gray hair. Kind of just, again, you know, if you look at the coat of a fox or a wolf or something like that, it has a lot of variation. You don't necessarily have to have, it's okay. It'll look good ultimately if there's a little more color variation. One of the things I try to do when painting an army is have consistent shadows and consistent highlights. So with this army, most of the shadows are coming in black. If you check out my Instagram page, you can see, like for my Sons of Behemoth army, I actually went with a dark kind of bruised blue shadowing throughout the entire army, which again helped pull it together. Don't be afraid to get messy on the palette, mix your colors on the palette, grab a little of this, a little of that. Don't rinse your brush out too often. It'll give you a nice variety. So now I'm coming in with the bases. We've got some of the Pro-Acryl Dark Umber. It's a great basing color. It's a very neutral, natural brown. I've got a fat makeup brush I'm using to come in on the sand of the bases, which at this point have dried. The wash that I gave all the bases has dried. And I am not being neat about this. I want these cloaks to be picking up some dirt and some grime, some mud and some muck. This will help further to add a little color variation to the army. Bringing some of the brown color from the bases up on the cloaks will both give them a sense of action and movement, like they're really in the field doing stuff, and will help break up some of the monotony of the black on black on black cloaks throughout the army. So this is fast. I mean, I'm not holding most of these miniatures for more than, 10 or 15 seconds, just going around the base real quick, getting a little bit of color on the edge of the bases, but I'm not trying to paint the edge of the bases right now. Right now I'm trying to paint the top of the bases and get some mud onto the cloaks. That's the important thing right now. We'll paint the edge of the bases neatly later on. And with 40 miniatures, 10 seconds or so per miniature, it doesn't take that long to do this step on the entire army. Now, Song of Ice and Fire Miniatures game is also played on movement trays. It is a rank and flank, big blocks of, well, not so big, small blocks of infantry in the game. So we're also going to grab the unit trays, and we'll do those too. With the bigger bases, I do pay a little bit more attention just because there's more there, but I'm still trying to get some mud up on the horses' hooves and stuff. So with the unit trays, I'm using exactly the same color, going really fast. I mean, this is the triple speed sped up version because watching somebody dry brush is a little bit like watching grass grow. But dry brushing the gravel, I'm not actually dry brushing at this point. It might be more correct to say that I'm wet brushing. And with the movement trays at this point, because I've got a big fat brush in my hand, I'm going to go ahead and put a first coat of brown on the edges, and I'll touch that up again later. So next up, we've got the Pro-Acryl Golden Brown. It looks more yellow on the palette there. I grabbed a clean palette because I just wanted to show you that yellow. It looks really yellow. Every time I pour it out of the bottle, I have to remind myself that I actually really like this color for bases. I think it's a nice complement to the dark umber, but man, does it look yellow when it's on the palette. But a real light coat of this, it doesn't look that way when it's dried. And once you hit it with a little bit of ivory on top, that dark umber, the golden yellow, and the light ivory, I think makes a nice basing trio. This step is even faster than the previous step, and we're really only spending maybe 5 seconds, if that, on each miniature. We're hitting the sand and hitting the edges of the bottoms of the cloak with this golden brown. Like I said, golden yellow, but it's called golden brown by Pro-Acryl. Super fast. This is what's making the texture of the rocks pop and is also giving some nice dingy dustiness to the cloaks. On some of these, like this one here, I'm also going to take that same golden brown and hit the fur on top with it. Again, this is not a uniformed army. This is natural colors. I put a little brown on the knee of that guy. You're kind of you're both trying to do a light layer of it, a light dusting of this, but you're also not trying to be extra neat. This is representing the dirt and dust and debris of the battlefield. Now, on the unit trays, you do want to be more careful to wipe your brush off at this stage. You're not trying to get big splotches of this color. Once you feel confident that you don't have so much paint on your brush that you're going to slop all over the place, you've given it a good wipe on the paper towel. Kind of give this a nice light dry brush. You're just trying to pick up the texture of the rocks. If I was going to teach a class on dry brushing, I'd have people practice dry brushing rocks because it's a very satisfying, rough texture that's easy to do well. You notice there, I've gotten a couple questions about the paper towel. I strongly prefer using the lint-free shop towels that you can get like at an automotive supply store or in the automotive section of a big box store that are blue, like the paper towel I've got in the lower left-hand corner there. I was having issues with some of my miniatures of finding little tiny bits of thread and lint on them, and I realized it was coming from the paper towels that I was using. So the paper towels that are meant for polishing cars and stuff like that are strongly preferred. I big thumbs up to the blue lint-free paper towels. All right, so as we wrap up this step, we're going to be going into the final dry brushing step where it's going to be an even lighter coat of dry brushing with a lighter ivory color. So dry brushing dries fast, you don't have to wait for this. All right, so for this step, this is where the army really comes together as a cohesive whole. You get to highlight the miniatures all at one time, all with the same color. So what we've got here is a little bit of the Pro-Acryl Ivory. This is a little bit lighter than bleach bone if you're familiar with the Citadel colors. It has a nice little bit of transparency while still having a lot of color in it. And I find that for a quick army paint job, you can use it essentially as an almost universal highlight color. You can use this ivory, the bright ivory works well too, but I wanted a little duller, more realistic tone for this army. So with the ivory, coming on with an Artist Opus dry brush, which is my preferred dry brush that I've got in my collection right now. And you're just hitting very lightly, almost always with downward brush strokes, very, very lightly going down and just hitting the very top surfaces of the model. The tips of the hair, the edges of the cloak, a little bit on the fur, elbows, shoulder pads, that sort of thing. What you're wanting to do with this step is draw your eye to the parts of the model that are sticking out. If you kind of imagine what are the parts of the model that you would hit first if you grabbed the model, you're trying to just brighten up the outside edges of the model, particularly focusing on the upper edges. Generally speaking, models look good if the top half of the model is a little brighter than the lower half of the model. It kind of lets your eyes start at the top and then move down to the base. And you can see what I'm doing here. I'm kind of hitting the face that will highlight the bridge of the nose and the ridges of the eyes. I'm trying to hit the hands and the haft of the weapon. You know, a lot of these models, this ivory is almost not going below the belt line at all. It's just real quick. Shoulders, faces, top of the head, hands, set it back down. The before and after on this is a really big difference. Adding that little light white highlight to all the upper surfaces, this is just kind of it's like adding a little highlight. I mean, it's called highlighting for a reason. You're highlighting all kind of the raised surfaces, and in highlighting all the raised surfaces, you're accentuating all the details and really bringing out all the details. The other effect that has, which is really important for a dark colored army, I actually think that having really bright highlights is even more important for an army that is predominantly darker colors. When you look at a model, the bigger the contrast between the highlights and the brightest highlights and the darkest shadows, I think the darker it makes the fabric look. It makes having a bright highlight makes the shadows look darker than they are. So going through, just as you can see, I'm only spending a few seconds on each miniature, but it really makes a big difference. gives the eye someplace to rest. And finally, on Ghost, who, one of the reasons I didn't paint a lighter horse is I really wanted Ghost to be the focal point of the army when laid out on a table. I'm taking the Pro-Acryl white, which is a really nice, vivid, vibrant white, and giving Ghost a light dry brush on his upper surfaces of his fur. Again, just hitting the tops, leaving the bottoms of the legs gray. And then something I'm going to do here with the same idea of the darker shadows, the same idea of the bright highlights making the dark shadows look darker on Ghost. I'm going to add some darker shadows to make the highlights look brighter. I want to maximize that contrast. So with a nice, small, fine detail brush, first I'm going to add in pure black and just go in carefully and painting his nose and his the edges of his mouth in a pure black. Adding a little bit of pure black into his eye sockets. Ghost is really gonna, when set up on the table, Ghost is gonna be one of the highlights of the army. Your eye is naturally gonna be drawn towards this big, bright white wolf that's standing on his own. So spending a little bit of extra time on one of the army's focal points is good. I'm making sure my paint is nice and thin, watered down a little bit to get the edges of his muzzle, painting his little wolfy smile, so to speak. And then the other key point on a wolf or a dog's face is going to be to get a little bit of shadow on the inside of his ears. And as you can see, as the model's tilted around, I've already got some nice shadows underneath the grays. And I'm just kind of black lining a couple of the most dramatic shaded areas with a little bit of pure black, again, just to pop that contrast up. A little bit of watered down black paint inside both of his ears. We've got a nice high contrast white wolf. That looks sharp. All right, finally with the dark umber, it's time to paint the edges of the bases. I've just got a nice clean brush with straight bristles. Paint is relatively durable. It should be okay to hold the painted models before priming them. Just hit the edges of the base. A little bit of pure dark umber, same color that I used for the initial dry brushing. I'll speed this up here so we're not going to show you all 40 models. I like using paint straight out of the pot for this. I like a little bit thicker paint to edge the bases. I don't want to get watery streaks, and I'm putting on a little bit thicker coat. So real quick, this is 10 or 15 minutes to paint all the edges of the bases, and that cleans up all the dry brushing marks and stuff like that. Painting the edge of the bases the same color as the first color used in dry brushing them, I think looks better and more natural than painting the edges of the base black, especially a base that's going to go into a movement tray. If the edges of these bases were black, you'd essentially end up having black circles around all your bases inside the movement tray, which I think doesn't look quite as good, or doesn't look quite as seamless. Painting the edges of the movement tray in the exact same brown so it all presents as kind of a coherent look for the army. The goal isn't to have the edges of the bases stand out, but just to tie everything together. And now the most fun step. Lots of tufts. So I've got a big collection of different colors of tufts and different heights, from GamerGrass to GMON. I think there's some Army Painter mixed in there. I often try to use 5 or 6 different types of tufts in an army. We've got this is the GamerGrass, the tall brown. We've got I think it's the GamerGrass long white or long winter. And I'm just almost putting these on randomly. I'm trying to put these on randomly. I've got a little bottle cap of super glue here. I'm using some tweezers to pop them on. And we've got a lot of tufts to do, so we're gonna speed this up. I really like this long spiky tufts from GamerGrass. I'm impressed with those. I found these at a cool little hobby shop in Statesboro. I'm sure you can find them online or locally too, especially on the edges of these movement trays where you've got a little extra space. Really nice tall tuft, looks great. These tall spiky brown tufts are probably ½ an inch tall. And using 5 or 6 different colors, 2 or 3 different heights, and get kind of a naturalistic look. And shout out to the Tajima tufts. They have the best adhesion of any tufts I've ever used. It's a tajima1.co.uk. Really great. I've been impressed with all of their products. So skipping ahead a little bit here, we've got really, like I said, if I could somehow just shake these up and throw them randomly, I would. I'm really looking for a random look to all the tufts on the army. So in between putting the tufts on and this step, I've matte varnished everything. A quick trip down to the airbrush booth, about 15 minutes to matte varnish everything. I think when I timed it, it was a little bit over 15 minutes. And now we're going to start putting on the Valhallan Blizzard. I haven't spent a lot of time trying to find a cheaper alternative to this. The Valhallan Blizzard is not cheap for how much of it you use. It's about, in the US, about $8 a pot. And I'll end up using almost an entire pot of this on this project. I'm just to do little patchy, melty snow. I think when you put too much snow on a base, you can sometimes overwhelm the model with a bright white base. I prefer the look of a melty, patchy snow. Dabbing a little bit of the melty fallen snow on top of the longer grasses is a nice look. You will have, snow, when you have a light, wet snowfall, you'll have some catching on the bristles, and it just gives another layer of visual interest. And when you painted the models really quickly, it's you're trying to have your miniatures look good on the table. That's a quick and easy kind of special effect you can do by dabbing a little bit of the snow on top of some of the longer tufts. I'm using just a really crappy old brush for this. One of the things I like about Valhallan Blizzard is you can kind of mush it around, and if you put a blob of it and it's kind of thicker in the middle, and you're using a brush to put it on, you can then use the bristles of the brush to kind of smoosh it around the edges, and you get a nice kind of clumpy, semi-transparent white. I mentioned that I matte varnished these before putting on the Valhallan Blizzard. That's a minor detail, but I do think it's an important detail. The Valhallan Blizzard has a slight satin finish that looks a little bit like wet, melty snow, which I think is why it works well in clumps like this. If I was trying to do white all over snow bases, I would use something else, probably AK Interactive Snow, or maybe Army Painter's Snow. And so just little bits and bobs without trying to get too precise here. I'm spreading this on. I'll sometimes switch between a sculpting tool and a brush. Sometimes a sculpting tool is easier to get a nice big blob on the base and then switch to a brush to spread it out. The bristles of the brush can give you a little more naturalistic look. So spackle it on with a sculpting tool, like so. And just get a little bit in and out. You're not trying to get an even coat, and then smoosh around the edges with a brush. You can put a little water on the brush if you want. It gives kind of just a nice sloshy winter mix. But it looks good. These are sturdy miniatures, doesn't matter. Drop them, slide them around. I've been really impressed with the quality of the Cool Mini or Not miniatures for being largely PVC. They do mix in some hard plastic for better details. But I've dropped them a bunch of times and I haven't had anything break yet. So far so good. So put it on with spackle, and then you can see here, I'm using the brush to kind of just moosh out the edges and give it that half melted sloshier look. Slow it down for this one so you can see a little bit more what I'm talking about with the sloshiness. Put it on a little heavier on this base. You can see it's how kind of denser and whiter in the middle, and then the Valhallan Blizzard in a thin coat kind of settles in between the gravel as if it's melting snow. And that's it. Here's the whole army, all the miniatures, 40 points, ready to go. Defend the wall, defend the kingdoms of men. So I think that's for about all told 7 hours of painting. I think that is a fun little hobby project that lets you get from unpainted models up to a finished playable army in just a couple of evenings of work. Thanks very much for watching. As everyone says, if you enjoyed the video, I'd love if you subscribe to my new channel. I'm going to keep making content for all the games that we're playing down here in Atlanta. And hopefully we'll see you on our next Jolly Lark.